Well, this is a recording from the Movements for African Emancipation. We're talking about the general conditions of the working class in Nigeria from a revolutionary perspective. We're with Mr. Gbenga komolafe.
Yeah.
Looking at Mr. Gbenga komalafe's profile, he's currently the General Secretary of the Federation of Informal Workers of Nigeria, FIWON. And he has experience with the American Center of International Labor Solidarity, and he has served as the Assistant General Secretary of the Trade Union Congress of Nigeria. So he's in the right capacity to talk to us about the conditions of the working class in Nigeria. So Mr. Gbenga komolafe, can you just tell us the history of the working class and their conditions, both formal and informal, and labor unions in Nigeria, down to where we have today?
Wow, the history of the Nigerian working class?
Yeah, just a brief round.
That's a lot. I think the history of the Nigerian trade union movement, the class is different from the movement. The working class movement actually encompasses not only workers' organizations like the trade unions, it also comprises even pro-working class organizations, NGOs, CSOs, intellectuals who are also pro-working class, and so on. They are all parts of the movement. But if we are to zero it down to the trade union movement, which is at the core, of the broad working class movement, I think we'll have to go back to the colonial period when the British were firmly established in the country, and actually formed the bulk of the employers, either as government or as private business owners. We had a couple of big British corporations. Some of them can be traced back to the slave trade era, like the UAC, the UTC, and so on and so forth, were also big employers of labor. And so the need for some sort of organization that will represent workers also arose as a result of the contradictions, the natural contradiction between employers and employees in any setting. The employer naturally wants to maximize profit, while the worker also wants to ensure that he gets a fairer deal from the output of his work. So, but in our own situation, the colonial period, that natural setting of the trade union movement was also, was heightened by the experience of discrimination against African workers by the British. So even well-educated Africans who work in the colonial civil service or who work as managers in the British firms were openly discriminated against. They were not allowed into the bars. They were, first of all, the wages were also discriminatory. They earned much more lower than their British counterparts. Even sometimes when they were obviously better, they did much more work than the white counterparts, and yet they earned lower wages and were also discriminated against in the bars and other social levels of interaction. And so the African workers at some point felt the need to also come together to resist this. And so we have the first organizing around that for the right not to be discriminated against as Africans, and also the struggle for fairer wages for the African workers. So The first attempts were by those working for some of those British companies, and also the teachers and the civil servants. After a lot of attempts, initial attempts, I think the first trade union was actually launched in 1912. The Civil Service Union, which became the first union. So later on, the Railway Workers Union was also came on board with a much more militant, much more proletarian tradition, because the railway workers actually comprise of those at the lower echelon, not the manager cadre that first initiated unionization moves in the civil service. But with the railway workers, we are really dealing with quite ordinary working people who the bulk of only the hold any managerial positions. Some of them work in the collieries, some of them work as coach drivers, and so on and so forth. And of course, the legendary Michael Imodu rose from that rank and became perhaps the most prominent figure in championing trade union rights and also human and civil rights of African workers within the context of the railway workers. So the whole process was, since this was also be a summary of a lot of events actually, the whole process was accelerated by the events of, was it 1940? The coal miners killing, the Enugu coal miners killing that happened as a result of the event that happened around workers who work in the coal mines in Enugu who were agitating for fairer condition of service. The story was that at some point the British managers got jittery because the workers were moving the dynamite. They use dynamite to actually, in the process of blasting the coal, from underground. So the British Federation, given the background of previous agitations, that perhaps the way the workers were moving the dynamite, they were going to attack them or something. So they ordered the police they invited the police and ordered them to start firing at the coal miners. At the end of the day, scores of coal miners were shot dead, even many more were wounded, and so that became a major point of agitation. Actually, that event united the trade union, the evolving trade union movement with the politicians, who are also the nationalist politicians, who are also agitating for political independence. So you are the likes of the Sikhist movement, who are also mainly young people from high school, who were influenced, very much influenced by libertarian ideas from Europe. Some of them were very conversant with radical left-wing organizations and ideas about the need for working people to be organized and to manage society on behalf of, in the best interest of everybody. So they were familiar with such progressive ideas. They were also familiar with nationalist agitations in the Americas, especially in the US. Marcus Garvey's massive United
crew improvement.
Negro Improvement Association, and the radical ideas of black emancipation that came from all of that. So these young people in the Zikist movement, identify openly with the workers, and there were uproar all over the country, massive demonstrations against the killings. I think that was 1949 actually, the coal miners' strike. So that was a real watershed. So it marked the beginning of a wellspring of radical organizing, both at the political front and also at the level of the trade unions. And so the trade unions were closely allied with the Zikists, played very prominent roles in the nationalist movement as well. And so, but unfortunately, we know what happened in 1953, 1957, when a wing of the nationalist movement led by Zik actually openly denied, openly disowned the young people in the Zikist movement, even though they were organized around his name. He was not a communist, so he didn't want to identify with those young communists. And of course, the British brought the Anti-Communist Acts of 1957 and got a lot of these activists arrested and imprisoned. People like Mokugo Okoye, Raji Abdallah, Sadu Zungu, Gogo Shunzeribe, most of them in their late 10s, early 20s, were imprisoned. And of course, even that act in itself also led to even more agitations and so on and so forth. So the strike, the coal miners' strike, and what has come to be known as the River Valley Massacre of 1949, the killing of the coal miners, actually marked a very radical departure for the movement. So by the 1960s, when Nigeria became independent, the trade unions, as it were then, found the need to also found a political organization, which they did. They founded the Socialist Workers and Farmers Party, SWAP, which was the first attempt to build a mass left-wing party, openly socialist party. But unfortunately, they were not able to they didn't really do well electorally. So there are a few other watersheds. I'm sure you guys must have heard about the Simeon Adebo Commission, which was mandated in the 60s to look at wages, to review salaries and wages, which was acknowledged to be very low at that time. And of course, the Simeon Adebo Commission came up with some proposals which marked some improvement, but which was not sufficient enough from the point of view of the unions. And so later on again, under General Gowon in the 70s, we had the Jerome Udoji Commission, which also reviewed the salaries and wages. And of course, we came to know about the famous, or rather infamous, Udoji Awards, which actually marked a significant improvement in wages and salaries of working people generally, and boost the capacity of workers and working people to consume more, to spend more, to also be able to live better. So people started to buy cars, buy electronics, buy or some of these appurtenances that supposedly marked, are the hallmark of a modern capitalist society. But whatever gains, that Jerome Udoji was so eroded by inflation, and so and that is also signified the limitation of reformist trade unionism. You can fight, get some concessions, or improvement in wages and all of that, but as long as the locus of social organization remains, or rather is such that concentrate wealth in very few hands, and the system of production, exchange and distribution is dominated by the bourgeois class, workers will always have the shorter end of the stick. And so I think it's also important to talk about some of the divisions in the movement that were because of the climate of the Cold War climate of international trade union organizing. You had those unions that were pro-West and those unions that were pro-East, that is the then USSR, East Germany and all of that. So those who are pro-East were naturally more radical, more ideological in their approach to unionism, while the pro-West wanted everything to be limited to mere wage negotiation, which, as we said earlier, can really be very limited, because whatever you gain now can be eroded in no time as a result of inflation. I did a post, interestingly, I did a post yesterday evening. I was just reading through a research work, and I found it very interesting, and so I decided to share a little bit of it. The wages in 19, it's very short, Facebook post, so I just want to read it, because it illustrates perfectly the point about reformist trade unionism and how limited the seeming gains in terms of salary reviews and wage increases that you might have once in a while. Okay, this is what I posted. According to official statistics, the Nigerian economy grew 300% between 1999 and 2015, while minimum wage declined from $137.6, which was 3,000 naira in 1998, to $83.3, which is 30,000 naira now in 2020, underscoring gross inequality. You can imagine. Though in former terms, there is an increase from 3,000 to 30,000. There is actually a decrease, because of the inflation, the devaluations, and the manipulation of the foreign exchange regime. So it's time to bridge this gap a little through emergency cash grants and massive funding of healthcare services, portable water supply, and public education, at least obviates the crippling impact of COVID-19 on the working poor. So the point being that the bourgeois class may make some concessions, give some wage increases, but at the end of the day, it might amount to little or nothing by the time you really sit down to look at the worth of those increases. And that consistently was the standpoint, has always been the standpoint of the more radical left-wing faction of the trade union movement. But the conflict between the two sides came into fore, I think, in between 1974 and 1976, when General Muritala Mohammed came into the scene, specifically in 1976, and decided that they were also going to rein the trade union movement. Like somebody said, the government was busy sacking everybody in the civil service and all of that, and they felt that they should also deal with the trade union movement. So they came up with the idea of banning union affiliation to any foreign international trade union federations. They also ended up banning veteran unionists like Imodu, Wahab Goodluck, P.A. Sagwa, and so on and so forth. They were banned for life. I mean, these guys committed no crime. They actually were not indicted for anything, but other than the fact that they were trade unionists who were principled and uncompromising. Actually, Wahab Goodluck was probed. They set up a probe. The probe panel, the Muritala government probe virtually everybody that could be probed. And at the end of the day, they discovered they couldn't really hold anything against him, because even he was rumored to have owned a lot of houses in Lagos. So at the end of the day, they discovered that he was even living in a rented apartment. But despite all of that, they still went ahead and banned him anyway, alongside the likes of Modu, who virtually had lived all his life for the working class. So they also unilaterally decided to merge. There were 4 trade union centers then. They merged all of them in what they call into the Nigerian Labour Congress. It's interesting that actually before the 1976 events and the decreeing into being of NLC eventually in 1978 by General Obasanjo, the 4 centers, both leftward and rightward centers of the movement, had actually agreed during the burial of a veteran at the Akwena Cemetery that they were going to unite and they were going to be known and be called Nigerian Labour Congress. So the unionists had actually agreed, despite ideological differences, to come together under the banner of a Nigerian Labour Congress before the military actually came in to destabilize that process and banned some of the more prominent leaders. So by 1978, eventually General Obasanjo came with the Trade Union Amendment Decree that literally decreed the NSC into being, as well as also decreed what we call the industrial unions and mandated workers to be members of those unions, and those unions to also be affiliated to the Nigerian Labour Congress. So that's how we came to have the later NSC. And I'm sure we are all at least a little bit familiar with the traverse of the Nigerian Labour Congress since then. But some of the landmarks were the minimum wage strike of 1981-82 by Alhaji Comrade Sumonu, who was the first president of the NSC after the union movement had been restructured by the military. The minimum wage strike happened during the tenure of President Shehu Shagari, and it led to some significant increase in wages and improvement in conditions of living of Nigerian workers. So we've had similar fights and strikes by Nigerian workers since then. Bella, we've earlier pointed out, there's always a limitation to what workers can gain by the traditional trade union agitation, demand for wage increases, blah, 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 when the fundamental exploitative structure of society and the system of production is not really challenged and transformed in a way that will be of benefit to the majority of working people rather than a few elite interests. And so we'll be having increases, and where we are now, where 3,000 naira in 1998 is actually worth much more than 30,000 naira in 2020, and even the 30,000 naira minimum wages being seriously contested. Where a lot of state governments are saying they can pay the 30,000 naira minimum wage, and despite the obvious growth in the economy, like it has been said, particularly between 2000 and 2014, when we had those big booms in oil prices. At some point, a barrel of crude was selling of close to $200, and Nigeria was actually making a lot of money, and which allowed for a lot of spending by the government, and so the economy actually experienced some level of expansion, a lot of growth, but without development, and so the result is what we're having now: massive unemployment everywhere, and against the context of COVID-19, the fear of a recession because of lower demand, lower international demand for Nigerian crude, which means lower capacity to earn foreign exchange and fund the national budget. So here we are faced with a recession with a minimum wage that is even less than what it was in 1998, which means that the trade union movement even has much more to do than before now to transform, not to challenge the fundamental basis of economic organization of society, the system of production, which is dominated by foreign multinationals and a few local elites, exchange, which is majorly by an extremely corrupt and opaque contract system, and distribution, which is really unfair and actually marginalizes the bulk of the working people. So there's a time to really challenge those structures, so that at the end of the day we can actually have a system that is fairer and that we all contribute to actually make. That is, there should be more participation in how production is organized. There should be more participation of working class organizations into how society is managed, how production takes place. It's time to begin to challenge the contrast, the opaque and corrupt contract system, and insist on direct labor and even state-owned firms that will be managed by working people themselves, own allegiance and responsibility to the whole of society, and not just to a few capitalists and a few shareholders. So it's time we have to challenge all those things, because if anything, the experience of the trade union movement in Nigeria has demonstrated very clearly that the traditional industrial relations, limited trade unionism we have had, you respond to perceived inflationary spiral, to demand for wage increase. Then some wage increase is granted. And usually it doesn't even meet all with what has been lost to inflation. You can see clearly from the history that doesn't go far, doesn't get anywhere to actually address the most basic needs of working people. And what do working people want? Good food for themselves and their family members. Workers are not really interested in having vacations in Barbados or London. They want decent education for their kids. When they fall sick, they want to be able to go to the hospital and be sure that they will receive efficient healthcare services. Good roads. That can facilitate efficient transportation system, good railway system, and so on. So what workers need are very basic and very simple. And any social system that cannot provide and guarantee the provision of these basic needs really must be challenged, because the resources are there, and we can see that from the fact that when most working people in Nigeria are living in misery, material deprivation. In the past 20 years particularly, we have actually become proud owners of billionaires. Nigeria now where poverty has exponentially grown in the past 2 decades. We've also had some few billionaires you can count on our fingertips. And just like the Oxfam International, there's an Oxfam International report in 2017 that actually demonstrates that a few of these people actually can pay the salaries of the rest of us for the next 10 years. So we now have individuals that are richer than the whole of society. We feel that that kind of social organization is definitely bankrupt. Doesn't work for. So